آسمون آبی همه جا، اما آسمون اون وقتها آبی تر بود. سردماغ بودن، بچه ها چاق بودن، جوونا قلچماق بودن، دخترها با حیا.
This is not a memoir, but an exploration of memory. This is not a documentation of the past, but rather a fictionalized search for it. This is an effort to understand both harm and care, both betrayal and forgiveness. But ultimately, this is an investigation of how our personal, collective, and historic memory contribute to the construction of power, shame, and beauty. The song we are listening to, sung by Mortezaya Ahmadi, is a ruhozi, a genre of traditional folk in which the singer comments on social and cultural trends. Ahmadi is describing the difference between pre-revolution and post-revolution Iran, comparing the depressing, oppressive present with the idyllic, free past. I chose this genre of music in order to further emphasize the importance of memory and of Iranian nostalgia in this project, to highlight how easy it is to romanticize our past, but how necessary it is to probe it critically and compassionately for the sake of understanding our wounds and of healing them. The Way to the Bread is a collection of short stories that focuses on 4 characters in Rehnan, a working-class neighborhood outside of Isfahan, Iran. The stories are situated during a Friday gathering in the pre-revolution years where one large family is eating together. Each story delves into each of the characters' pasts in order to better understand how they choose harm in a singular moment. For some, it's a search for power. For others, it's misguided care. No matter their intention, each leave a mark on Lale, a young girl who falls victim to colorism, beauty, and the patriarchal violence perpetuated within her own family. The collection tries to examine how exactly trauma is intergenerational and how exactly harm is passed on between one another, but also how we learn to care for one another. In this interview with Mejgana Masumi, a PhD candidate and scholar of Persian history, we discuss the work, what it's about, and parts of its theoretical underpinnings.
One of the things I find really compelling about your stories is your ability to connect with elements in nature. And your first character is a girl named Lale, and she has this relationship with the sun. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
I just remember hearing the story that my mother told me one time of her aunt, of her sister, my aunt, who was a young girl. She's darker than my mother. Her skin color is darker. And she still loves the outdoors. We always talk about the outdoors with each other. But in this one particular instance, she was laying out in the sun and she was told that she was getting too dark and that she should probably, not go into the sun again. And in the story, my mother told me she was kind of embarrassed about it and, actually avoided the sun for a while. But I was really curious to know, what does that feel like to, love the outdoors so much? I myself have a very, strong connection to the outside. I love being in the sun and I love the heat of it. I love summertime. And I wondered what it felt like to have to cut that off because of expectations about beauty and why that expectation was so important that one would sacrifice kind of their love for the outside. And so in the story with Lala, I kind of tried to explore that. She's a young girl at the time, and she's told by one of her, distant family members that she shouldn't be out in the sun, that she would be too siyah, which is a pretty racially loaded term that means just too dark in Farsi. And so I wanted to explore why she would make that cut. And the answer honestly comes from just beauty in general, and why beauty is so emphasized in our culture, and in my neighborhood specifically from Rehnan. A lot of it has to do with marriage, and I try to explore that in other stories. But the reason Lala does it is because of her own internalized shame that already exists, her already feeling unworthy. And so, shame kind of compounds itself, and so she would want to kind of decrease it as much as she could.
Absolutely. So self-esteem and ego and confidence, seem to be central to each of the characters. And of course, Mehrab's no exception, and especially with this complicated relationship with his mother. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how his relationship with her affects him and his ideas about sexuality?
Totally. So there's an anecdote in the story, in Mehrab's story, where he sees these dogs that are having sex with each other, and he's reminded to another time he sees his one of his friend's older brothers having sex with somebody. That person is ambiguous because we don't know who it is, and it doesn't matter either to Mehrab. Mehrab is excited by it as a kid. He sees this sexual act, and it excites him. And so he keeps that memory with him. And when he sees these dogs, he's kind of reminded of that desire. And immediately he feels disgusted with himself because just dirtiness and cleanliness are so emphasized, and the act of sex is so dirty that it immediately brings him with shame. And so in this instant, he's kind of mixed with, this feeling of desire, also shame, and also anger at these dogs for practicing this thing in public space. This thing that he knows should be private, that should be kept away. He feels enraged by it. And so he ends up hitting these dogs with his guy friend, with with these other boys. And they beat them. And he ends up going home. And his mother, who doesn't know what's happened, says, my beautiful boy, like, cups his face and immediately absolves any guilt that he had, even though he still feels that shame that's deep inside him. And so he's never able to really verbalize this discomfort. Instead, he's immediately absolved of any guilt, and it kind of restricts him in a way. He's not able to show, express all of him, just the good parts of him, just the way his mother sees him. And then ultimately, he believes that his mother's lying to him because of that instance where she sees him and Jay share, a non-intimate kiss. She pulls him away, and she feels angry at him, and they don't speak for a few days. And so ultimately, Mehrab feels like he can only be loved if he's a very specific kind of perfect. And this doesn't really revolve around his sexuality or his performance of it. It more revolves around his performance of his gender, of his masculinity, which ultimately I believe, like, when people talk about the patriarchy and how harmful it is to women, certainly more harmful to women, but it does impose restrictions on men as well. There's trauma associated with the patriarchy onto men as well. And so I wanted to see what that was, what that, trauma was. And it leads people to do, harmful things, which, like I mentioned earlier, he betrays his own daughter and his wife to feel better about himself.
So all of these characters sort of, you're really interested and show the complexity of the human condition and identities. And you talk a lot about shame and culture and sexuality. How are these larger, broader themes you're giving us related? How do you see them being related? And are there any disciplines or perhaps professors at Stanford or beyond that you found particularly helpful in your writing journey?
In Toni Morrison's essay, The Site of Memory, she introduces the theory of literary archaeology, which combines the disciplines of creative writing and archaeology in order to create historical truth. In Morrison's essay, she states that, on the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork, you journey to the site to see what remains were left behind and to reconstruct the world that these remains imply. In my case, the remains come in the form of fragmented memories, stories passed down within my family, and historical images gleaned from my own academic journey at Stanford. I use these remains to reconstruct characters who are in conflict with the hegemonic enforcement of both gender and sexuality. For example, non-heterosexual relationships described between Jay and Mehrab are a product of my own experiences with same-sex desire in Rehnan. I was also influenced by the figure of the ambiguous beloved, as defined by historian Afsaneh Najmabadi. Her book, Women with Mustaches, Men Without Beards explores the literary and visual culture of the 19th century Qajar dynasty in order to map changing ideas about gender and sexuality and the impact they have on Iranian life. Najmabadi identifies the difference in views on sexual desire between Western Europe and Qajar Iran, the latter's emphasis on singular acts as opposed to the former's emphasis on inherent forms of desire. Both Amarads and Mukhanas, degendered people distinct from adult men, become a striking example of this difference because of how they were an unpunished and unrestricted object of sexual desire for traditionally masculine men. Najmabadi observes, instead of considering homosexual men a minority of peculiar queer disposition, men are seen to engage in same-sex practices, but only for a minor period of their life cycle, until they settle into procreative sexuality with their wives. In addition to exploring ambiguous sexuality, Najmabadi explains the role of the European gaze on Qajar modernists in wishing to eliminate this indeterminate nature of desire. The modernists believed that in order to have normative heterosexuality, prized by the Europeans, that the veil and other social institutions that segregated gender would need to be eliminated altogether, thus eradicating compulsory homosexuality. This reconceptualization of sexuality prompted me to engage with homosocialized relationships, shifting away from queer identity and instead moving towards temporally bound same-sex desire. I am interested in the nature of sexual, platonic, and romantic relationships in the decade before and after the 1979 revolution, where, unlike the Qajar dynasty, both normative heterosexuality and compulsory homosociality were and still are the order of the day, especially in religiously conservative communities like Rehnan. Najmabadi's work, along with readings of 13th century Iranian poetry, made me curious to consider how historical conceptions of sexuality have trickled into contemporary relationships, and ultimately, how those conceptions affect family, marriage, and self-image. Using Morrison's framework of literary archaeology, along with my own experiences within Iranian studies, I found that within Jay, Golnar, and Mehrab's experience, defining sexuality is neither helpful nor hurtful. It is the suppression of desire and the shame that suppression creates that makes these characters susceptible to creating violence in pursuit of psychological relief.
Just pushing a little bit more on this theme of the patriarchy, but now I guess more so in terms of how it also affects women, of course. Let's move on to your character Gulnar. How does the suitorship system and marriage in Rehnan affect Gulnar's self-image and her own self-esteem?
We kind of explore desirability in Golnar's story within the hammam. And the hammam is a very central location in Iran, specifically in Rehnan. Back then, before, houses had water piping, there was a central place for showering, and this was the hammam. And so, everyone would go a couple times a week. It was a very social place. Still is, it still does exist. It's a place for women to get together, for them to talk, for them to really just focus on themselves, to focus about their own cleanliness, to kind of, go through the motions of washing and cleansing, and also chatting with other women. And so again, this is kind of a place, a location of communal care. Women wash each other, they help each other. But with that, there's also an element of shame just with all the eyes that are always there. Oftentimes, some women are there to look for wives for their sons. And even if that's not the case, there's a sense of comparison that's everywhere, even. And so Golnar in the hammam, she really scrutinizes herself a lot. She wishes different parts of her body were different. Within the suitorship system, when so much emphasis is placed on, financial stability, there's not much time to really get information about one's virtues and who one is and what they value and stuff like that. And so really beauty kind of becomes a heuristic for that. Beauty is a quick way to decide whether someone is good or not. And so when marriage is about financial stability, then marriage becomes about safety too. And so beauty becomes safety. And so it would make sense that someone would feel so much shame about how they look when their safety is at stake, when their stability is at stake. And so Goldenor kind of feels that as shame in the hammam. And it manifests, and that shame kind of affects how she is able to love and care for Lole, which is her niece. And we explore how that happens later on.
I have to say, Kamran, as a historian myself, I really do appreciate your appreciation for and emphasis on understanding history in order to inform the wonderful stories you've given to us. Our time is coming to an end, but before we go, I'd really like for you to read an excerpt of your writing, anything of your choosing, of your choice, to share with us.
Cleanliness, the real kind at least, is a fool's endeavor. But how could anyone think of anything but that when the spring air makes one's eyes water? When its grip tugs at tears and wets one's cheeks without a trace of either joy or grief. Just obedience to the cleanliness of God's world. Puck, that's the word they use to describe it. Letters topple out of their mouths when they say it, like a cloud dream, reaching the ground in a lazy spiral before it decides on this spot here to surrender itself to the dirt below. The word falls over their tongues like phantom footsteps of pine needles after the rain. Puck. The word pops in the air, lingering there for as long as dirt, pollen, and other things, quieter things, secret things do. The word cannot be rivaled by a hand broom brushing over carpet, nor by soapy rags drawn across silverware. More than diligence and divinity are needed for a fool to get there. So they dream and pray. There, it's possible. But still they try. They rub pumice against their soles, weigh against their limbs, and shampoo from glass containers into their hair if they can afford it, and from plastic ones if they cannot. They sweat and scrub, rub and slide, finger and fold wet in water against their bodies to clean. Take me there, they plead, to that place, where the air stings and tastes of minerals, where filth is nothing more than an old fable. Women take off their gold and scrub their undergarments in the hammam the week that their blood comes. Men grate their hands and toes with any water, hard or soft, before they read their palms, speak to the sky, and kneel. And they continue to dream, knowing well that nothing compares to the sting of pine after a spring storm. Perhaps that's why they are fools. How could anyone will their cheeks wet without the presence of either grief or joy? Or perhaps they are fools because they think God is watching. And of course, God is. But elsewhere, far from a fool's gaze. At an egg over a child's head. At a man who dreams of flowers, but not the scented kind. In any case, instead of looking at their ignorance, the fools run after the sting, searching for those letters that comfort their tongue, swishing the taste of deliverance over their gums. Puck. That's God's word. That's God's work. That's God.